Hello and welcome. I'm Corine Tachtiris, prose translation editor at the Massachusetts Review. The Mass Review is so pleased to host this reading that features translations of works from across Asia, translated from Asian languages, translated by Asian translators, recently published or forthcoming in our pages. Our first reader will be Mirgul reading from her translation from Kazakh of Fire by Mukhtar Magauin, published in our summer 2020 issue. Mirgul translates from her native Kazakh. Her translations of short stories by classic and contemporary Kazakh writers have appeared in Tupelo Quarterly, Electric Literature, Exchanges, the Massachusetts Review, and other publications. She is a recipient of the 2018-2019 American Literary Translators Association's Emerging Translator Mentorship. Mukhtar Magauin is one of the most important contemporary Kazakh writers of the older generation. Born in 1940 in eastern Kazakhstan, he published his first short stories in literary magazines in the early 1960s. A literary scholar and historian, he studied and wrote extensively about early Kazakh literature. Magauin has written many short stories, novellas, and novels, most of which explore the Kazakh national identity through characters living through the times of great uncertainty or upheaval in cultural, social, and political life. He received the Kazakh State Award in Literature, the biannual prize for an outstanding work of fiction in 1984, as well as the title of the Kazakh National Writer in 1996. And now, Mirgul.
Thank you, Corine. I'm going to read a short passage from a novel by the cult Kazakh writer Mukhtar Magauin that tells the story of a traditional musician who finds himself unable to practice his art during the early years of the Soviet rule. In this passage, the protagonist, Toksaba, who had just got married, is returning home with his young wife and a group of friends and relatives. The path through the mountains led into a narrow serpentine ravine with dense forests of birch and poplar on both sides. A caravan of 9 camels, loaded with bridal dowry and accompanied by a couple dozen men and women on horseback, slowly made its way along the rocky trail, now ascending steadily, now dipping abruptly downhill. The sun, that had only recently been seen high overhead, occasionally peeked between the stark gray hilltops, which crowded and clambered on top of one another. At times, the sun hid behind them, and shadows fell on the canyon walls, turning them deep green. Only the pale bark of the tall birch trees, slender and close-set, shone dimly in the dark. Toksaba, riding in the middle of the procession, kept turning to look at his bride. At their wedding, he had not played the traditional meek and modest bridegroom, courting the in-laws, and had made timid Zauresh uncomfortable with his bold displays of affection. She had covered her blushing face with her hand and whispered, "Please, Toksaba, stop. People are looking." She had seemed to be telling him to save it for when they were alone. And although they were still not alone, she had become more carefree, even brash at times, since leaving her native Aul. She caught up with Toksaba and, leaning against him, showered his face with breathless kisses. Pressed against Toksaba's bold-faced Don stallion, her sprightly bay horse had to slow down on the slim rocky path. At the top of the next peak, they caught a glimpse of the blazing red sky between a 2-humped hill ahead of them. Toksaba threw a glance at Zauresh and saw her pull the reins. Her lips parted slightly and a shadow passed over her bright face. "What is that?" she said. Toksaba turned around. A cloud of smoke rose from behind Mirzakhan, the highest point of the pass. The caravan halted. "Looks like a wildfire," said one of the men. "It's July. The grass gets so dry it easily catches fire. Let's hurry. We need to get to the valley before sundown." When they reached the top of the ridge at Mirzakhan and started downhill, they saw that not only the base of the mountains, but the entire valley was ablaze. The billowing clouds of smoke rose in the west and east, wherever the eye turned. The foothills ahead of them were burning too, and it looked like the fire had begun working its way into the mountains, It seemed to be moving especially quickly toward the narrow canyon, hedged on both sides by thick shrubbery, and the travelers realized that if they kept going, they would soon run into it. A gray veil of smoke shrouded the sky, illuminated by the setting sun. When the smell of burning wood reached their nostrils, the camels began snorting and balking, and the older members of the party started praying loudly. Some of them suggested turning the caravan around, but Toksaba, who was intimately familiar with the area, spoke against it. He knew that the rapidly spreading fire would quickly catch up with them. Further ahead, where the ravine took a dip, there was a mountain ship trail that climbed along the side of a ragged brown wall of the gorge toward the thinning woods above. The caravan followed Toksaba, hurrying toward its only escape route. The scattered group of men, women, and animals reached the trailhead and began working their way up the meandering single-track path. When the first members of the party had made it to a wide, flat terrace cut into a precipitously rising slope, a couple of the rearmost camels were still at the lower part of the hill. The fire was drawing near, and Toksaba and other men quickly jumped off their horses and tumbled down the hill. A heavy load on the last camel tipped, and the animal halted, teetering on the edge of a rock. One of the men rushed to get hold of the camel, while the others hastily tightened the ropes that held the bales on its back. "Cut it," Toksaba yelled. "Cut it, I said." The men looked at him in confusion. Toksaba pulled them aside and, pulling his knife out of its sheath, began slashing the ropes, securing the load. A large wooden chest inlaid with bone and golden wire was the first to go. Filled with expensive china that was a part of the bride's dowry, it rattled as it bounced down the hill and soon disappeared in the flames below. The bale on the other side went next. This one didn't roll down the slope. Landing awkwardly on its side, it became lodged in the hollow of the path. Toksaba cracked his whip, and the large male camel, bewildered by the sudden unburdening and the proximity of the fire, ran up the hill in a wide, gawky stride. It jogged past the flat area where the rest of the party had been waiting, and bellowing loudly, continued up the hill. The men followed, crawling on all fours, slipping and stumbling. Everyone was safe now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mirgul. Our next reader will be Mohammad Shafiqul Islam, reading from his translation from Bengali of The Color of Death by Selina Hossain, published in our fall 2020 issue. Mohammad Shafiqul Islam, poetry editor at Reckoning, is the author of 2 poetry collections, most recently Inner State, published at Daily Star Books, and translator of Humayun Ahmed's selected short stories and aphorisms of Humayun Azad. In February 2017, he was poet in residence at the Anuvad Arts Festival in India, and his poetry and translations have appeared in a number of journals, and his work has been anthologized in several books. He's currently at work on a few translation projects and is Associate Professor of English at Shahjahal University of Science and Technology in Sylhet, Bangladesh. Selina Hossain is an eminent storyteller of Bengali literature, the author of a great number of novels and stories with varied themes, including women's life, poverty, rural life, solitude, alienation, and urban complexities. There are about 40 novels and more than a dozen short story collections to her credit. Hossain is among the most best-known writers of contemporary Bengali literature. She is also an editor and founder of Priyalara Foundation and the recipient of many prestigious awards. So over to you, Shafiq.
Thank you so much, Corine. Good evening to everyone from Bangladesh. I'm going to read the story today that is titled The Color of Death, and it's one of the famous stories by Selina Hossain, and the tone is a bit dark, and I'm going to read a few pages of the story. Hamid's wife has been in the hospital for 2 days at the gynae ward of the medical college. No indication for delivery yet. At times she feels a little pain. Not so severe though. If asked, the nurse says that the doctor will wait a day more. Otherwise, she will need an operation. Operation? As soon as Hamid hears it, he puts his hand into his pocket. Garment factories are closed. Jobless for 2 months, he is already indebted to his brother. He doesn't even have enough for the treatment. But operation? The thought makes his blood pressure rise. Hamid gets into an open space behind the gynae ward, smokes a cigarette. Although very poor, he can't help smoking. By giving up certain foods, he saves money for cigarettes. Smoking cigarettes is a means to conceal oneself. At least he thinks so. Dead bodies of newborns are piled up here. A few who have died before birth are also thrown in his place. Their eyes remain closed. They are nobody beyond any specific identity. They are just human children. If there is a delay in taking them to a morgue, a bad smell emanates from their bodies. The smell is carried on his cigarette smoke and becomes one with Hamid's breath. It even enters his lungs. No, he doesn't feel like spitting. He can visualize the decayed dead bodies in the faces of the people of the city before his world falls apart. Throwing the burning cigarette away, he thinks, let everything burn down. After spending 2 days here, he has observed that the dead bodies of the newborns are eventually taken to a morgue. And then the car from the Anjuman Mufidul Islam welfare organization carries them to a graveyard. Hamid lights another cigarette. Many things are whirling inside his head. Fortunately, there is an organization like Anjuman Mufidul Islam in Dhaka. But why do people leave their own children unclaimed? How can they do this? Hamid puts his hand into his pocket yet again. If pockets are empty, there aren't many things you can do, only console yourself. It's not fair to ask people about their capabilities. With deep concentration, Hamid keeps looking at the mound of dead newborns. From a distance, it seems a heap of rubbish, like the heaps scattered here and there in the city. Only after getting close can one recognize their human bodies. The children with hands, legs, head, hair, chest, back in a perfect shape, and so on. If they die inside homes, parents throw them away. Very few children receive parental care and then go to graves. The grave is a cruel place, or peaceful. Hamid can't come to a conclusion. He's like that. He takes time to come to a conclusion. He can never decide. Remains flat over work and oof. With the nurse's permission, he enters the ward to see Firoja. When he draws near the bed, it appears to him that her eyes are blinking like flickering lamps. He holds her hands. You? Asks Firoja, startled. How do you feel? I don't know. Does the baby move? I can't tell. Doesn't he move his legs? Who knows? Have you eaten? Yes. You? No. I saved money. Didn't you smoke? Yes, I did. Then how is money saved? Firoza looks away. Are you angry? No. How long will you keep standing on the veranda? Now go home. I'm waiting to hear the baby's cry. I'll hear the sound of his first cry. You won't be able to hear, but I will. Okay, fine. If I can't hear him make a sound, I'll just keep standing beside the dead newborns. Dead newborns? Firuza's hair is spread out on the pillow. The nurse comes in and tells him to leave. Hamid goes out. He's extremely hungry. He ate only roti and aloo bhaji at his brother's house in the early morning. Hasn't had anything else the whole day. While drinking water from tube well outside, Hamid can see Anjuman Mofidul Islam's car in front of the mall. Maybe there is an unclaimed dead body to be taken away. Those who have everyone in a distant village go unclaimed forever for certain reasons. People who die by accident commit suicide, or people who are killed or disappear. Oh, so many types of deaths. Only those who die inside homes can understand any of this. What does it matter if they have owners or are unclaimed? Hamid still waits. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Shafiq. Our next reader will be Bernard Capinin, reading from his translation from Filipino of Santiago's Cult by Kristian Sendon Cordero, forthcoming in our fall 2021 issue. Bernard Capinin is a poet and translator. His translations have appeared or are forthcoming from Ularat's Best Contemporary Short Stories in Translation from the Philippines, from Gaudi Boy Translates, the Arkansas International, the Washington Square Review, Agni, and elsewhere. He is one of the winners of the 2020 Words Without Borders Academy of American Poets Poems in Translation Contest. He lives in the Philippines. The author, Kristian Sendon Cordero, is a poet, fiction writer, translator, and filmmaker based in Bicol, Philippines. His books of poetry have garnered him numerous awards, including the Southeast Asian Writers Award. He currently runs an independent bookshop and art space, The Savage Mind, in his home city. He will be a 2022 Artist in Residence Fellow of the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study to complete his first novel. And over to you, Bernard.
Thank you, Corine. I'll be reading excerpts from Cordero's short story, Santiago's Cult. This is a coming-of-age story set in a small town in Bicol during the martial law period. Here, the narrator's father, a soldier, is accused of being an aswang, a vampire-like mythical being. As soon as the lamp was lit at 6 every evening, and the chickens fluttered down from the cacao and jackfruit trees, father would leave. He wore shabby military fatigues, boots as large as my legs, and an antique amulet on which was inscribed an angelus that only father could read and understand. Que sexop, Dios míos, Deus noter. I had once attempted to say it aloud, but I almost followed my own tongue. He said that the prayer is sacred, that words have their own power, and that these should not be taken lightly. When one time he had caught me in the act of stashing it in my pocket, father had warned me that if I continued to utter the angelus, all my hair would fall out and my tongue fully contort. I had wanted to use the triangular amulet with an open eye in the middle as ammunition. It was said to be the Lord's eye, the vision of the open eye, which seemed to have been carved out of the sky by lightning, was said to have been seen by my father's grandfather. The amulet weighed as much as a dozen marbles, and 20 flattened bottle caps. We used to play that scene. Whenever father wore the amulet, no metal or bronze could wound him, only lightning, snake bite, or any bite from a wild animal. Instead of scolding and welting me with his belt after catching me, father would calmly ask for his amulet and merely exchange it for a peso he took out from his ear. These past few months, father's departures had become more frequent. He came home in the early hours of the morning, like the bats living in the old bell tower in the Church of Santiago, who was father's favorite saint. So when I was born on the day of the saint's feast day, he didn't hesitate to make me a namesake of the mountain saint. Santiago was the patron saint of cavalry and soldiers. He was one of the Lord's 12 disciples, one of San Juan's brothers. Prominently seen in his iconography were decapitated heads and dismembered men strewn underneath Santiago's figure. They wore flashy turbans and had mustaches, like those of Plaridel or Antonio Luna, seen above blackboards, that seemed to have been curled by mother's friend. The men scattered below the patron saint's feet were apparently called Moros, enemies of the Christians. Even before the arrival of the Spaniards, they were said to often raid towns and abduct young women to take as childbearers and slaves. Moros were said to have been weaned on pigs' hearts when they were still in the womb. These people were the same ones that San Miguel trampled upon on the gin bottle's label. If one happened to examine him closely, Santiago's eyes looked as if they were overflowing with anger. His eyeballs, said an old sacristan, were cast from gold that came from a mountain of ice in South America, while the head and arms were fashioned from pure ivory in Africa. Many have tried to steal the santo, but no one has ever succeeded. The Moros, who still continue to wreak havoc, had also attempted to steal it during the first years of the Spanish era, but due to the miraculous statue, they had not been able to sack our town. Rumors had spread that Santiago's horse would come alive and sprout flaming horns like those of a bull if ever an enemy should come near it. It was believed that its eyes were more powerful than the amulet Father wore, and that anyone wielding it would attain unbelievable strength. There had also been some rumors in town that each time the Santo went missing from its altar, it was accompanying Father's group whenever they raided the towns of Topas, Malawag, and Tapayas, which were reportedly teeming with rebels that Apo had ordered to be pursued. These rebels were the new Moros. "Your father's an aswang," shouted my playmate Intoy, when I lost at text and grew tired playing. It was as if Mother Spirit had possessed me and wanted to force feed my playmate with sand when I heard him saying it. "Is there an aswang that prays to the saints, Aber?" I retorted back at Intoy, clutching his remaining 3 text cards of Panday and Pedro Penduko. "Ay, whatever our neighbors say that your father is an aswang. That's why your mother has a mask on her throat. And why don't you grow? Because you have asbok blood." Not contented, he continued to shout until he went home. "Tiago, midget, supot." He acted like a ravenous crow, hurling insults at me until he was swallowed up by the dark that gradually enveloped the town. The last thing I heard was the sudden crack of his voice. I went home carrying the text, as thick as my books, that I had acquired. I hid them in a small cabinet so that Mother wouldn't find them. That night, I couldn't take my mind off Intoy's claim that my puniness and Mother's mass were because of my father was an aswang. To be an aswang was even more terrifying. There were stories around town that long before the missionaries arrived, our town had been a nest of malignant and evil spirits. Only Santiago could vanquish their camp. The aswang were evil beings, and those devils were often seen wandering during a new moon to devour new victims. An aswang must take a coconut shell with 2 eyes and slather it with guano before it could levitate into the darkness and kill. There are 2 types of aswang: an aswang who could fly, known as manananggal, and an aswang who walks, called an asbok. They were both acolytes from hell. In those days when God was dead, they gathered in the Mayon volcano to reaffirm their allegiance to the dark powers. Aswang were afraid of water, especially holy water. And once, when a woman was thought to be an aswang in our town during the Japanese occupation, she was dragged to the river, her hips tied to a large stone, and was thrown in the water. If the woman was an aswang, she wouldn't sink, as she would use her powers to walk on water and escape. But when she sank and died, the woman was proved innocent. That woman died from bleeding. Her blood had mixed in the river. The woman had been 2 months pregnant, and her husband had just been found dead while gathering coconuts, and the 2 were rumored to be spies for the Japanese. Most believed that there were more female aswang, and that they were more powerful than the male aswang. Female aswang were more ferocious when angered, like giant hens. When the moon was full, the aswang appeared, some strolling in the air, or if not, in the basement, feasting on the spit of the ill. Fuera Diyos, fuera hulog. This was the Angelus the aswang chanted. It meant, "There is no God, I will not stumble." There is another Angelus uttered repeatedly by aswang, until their spreading wings sprout Siri-siri, daing Diyos kung banggi, labaw sa kakahoyan, lagbas sa kasirongan. Do not fear, do not worry, there is no God in the night, above the forest, outside the basement. Sometimes they took the form of a boar, a cat, or even a dog. Phlegm was a vitamin to them, and blood was water to quench their thirst. Aswang could not be killed, they only hibernated. So before they went into hibernation, the aswang first had to pass a black orb to whichever relative or person they chose to propagate the line. An aswang could not rest until it had passed it on to others. I have heard these stories retold by elders of the town, who little by little had died and perhaps had been the victims of aswang themselves. But still their tales remain, with a warning to never tell stories about aswang on Tuesdays and Fridays, because the aswang's hearing is more acute on those 2 days. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bernard. And our final reader will be Chamini Kulatunga, reading from her translation from Sinhalese of A Thin Net Over an Abyss by Lianagan Amarikurki, forthcoming in our fall 2021 issue. Chamini Kulatunga is a Sri Lankan translator. She's a graduate of the Iowa Translation Workshop and a former visiting fellow at Cornell University's South Asia program. Chamini is currently working as Asymptote's editor-at-large for Sri Lanka and as an associate editor at the Songbridge Project, a nonprofit publisher of literary translations based in Iowa City. She is a recipient of Cornell University's Global South Translation Fellowship in 2021, and her work has appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Los Angeles Review, World Literature Today, Asymptote, Project Bloom, and elsewhere. Lianagan Amarikurki is a contemporary Sri Lankan writer, critic, and academic. He is the author of 8 collections of short stories, 5 novels, and 2 collections of poetry. He is also a writer of 2 children's books, 6 academic books, and 10 translations into Sinhalese. His novel, Athawaka Putu, Half Moon Suns, won the Best Sinhala Novel Award at the 2008 State Literary Festival. He's also the recipient of the National Award for Literature in 2000, the Swarna Pustaka Award in 2014 and 2016, and the Vyodaya Literary Award in 2014 for his fiction and prose works. Over to you, Chamini.
Thank you, Corine, for that introduction and for encouraging me to submit and helping me edit this piece. The title of the story is A Thin Net Across an Abyss, a phrase borrowed from Wittgenstein. This is a story that casts a satirical eye on the current education system in Sri Lanka that we largely inherited through British colonialism. And I'm only going to read a few excerpts from the story because it's a very long, short story. Excerpt 1. The story I'm about to tell you is a strange one. For now, let's not worry about the names of the characters. Let's call them man, woman, and child. Was it Baudelaire or Mallarmé that said, to define is to destroy? Naming is like that too. To name is to kill. Excerpt 2. Man's parents were teachers, so were women's. They both grew up hearing the mantra, if you don't get a good education, the world will laugh at us. Remember, your parents are teachers. This mantra was chanted verbatim in both households and eventually became the 6th Buddhist precept in their houses. Excerpt 3. So the kids passed the scholarship exam in the 5th grade, the ordinary level exam in the 11th, and the advanced level exam in the 13th grade. The 4 teachers were happy. They were now safe from the laughter of the world. Then the kids obtained their degrees, took the college batch photo, enlarged and framed photos of themselves wearing regalia, found good jobs, got married, built a house, bought a brand new car, got promoted, even with a little delay, had child, enrolled him in an English medium preschool, made friends with people who had kids in English medium preschools, became happy if their new friends lived similar lives, and if they didn't, man and woman found happiness in each other's company. Before I go any further, there's something I need to confess. Man in the story is me, woman, my wife, and child is my son. The reason I used these names in the first part of the story was because that's how I'd like to look back at my life up to that point. Generic. Except for one day when I was 13, I was punished for breaking the 6th precept. A nasty kid in my class taught me how to screen a movie on a wall using a flashlight and a cookie box. This nasty kid had several old film rolls he'd gotten from his uncle who worked at the Imperial Cinema. He also had made his own film with hand-drawn pictures in red, blue, and black ink. He'd used stories from the comic book Citara. The nasty kid not only taught me how to make the cookie box projector, he also gave me his hand-drawn film roll along with the used one from his uncle. Soon, I was obsessed with the film screening business. And I started breaking the 6th precept. The precepts are bound to be broken at some point, right? Isn't that why they've been imposed on mankind in the first place? Why isn't there one like, thou shalt not fly? Because those who make those precepts know that people can't fly and wouldn't try it either. Precepts are there because it's just natural for people to try and do the restricted verbs followed by the shall not. So as I went deep into this projecting business, I wanted to make a theater of my own. So I pushed my desk into a corner of my room, covered it with the biggest blanket I could find, and crawled under the table. It was dark, pitch dark. I held the projector against the black space in front of me. Almost all the pictures from the Imperial Cinema was the same, but not the one the nasty kid had drawn. It had characters like Toga, Unico, Dedunu, Callum from local comics. And there was also a picture of a man and a woman doing that thing. It was so lifelike, as if we'd seen them doing it for real. It was when I kept staring hypnotically at this last picture that my mother looked under the table. The couple was doing it on the wall. My teacher mother ran away with a high-pitched squeal. In her mind, I'd broken several precepts under that pitch-dark table. Then my teacher father tried me and passed the verdict. I was knelt down and made to chant the 6th precept for a good long while. Later that day, my mother made a complaint to one of her teacher friends in my school and caught the nasty kid who spoils innocent kids. She also made sure that the nasty kid's teacher find the nasty film roll in his backpack. And in order to protect the 6th precept, I had to break the 4th, thou shalt not lie. I didn't bother finding what happened to the nasty kid afterward. I heard he was transferred to another school. Did I tell you that I was reminded of this story when my son was 9? It was when this story gate crashed my mind that I realized how our lives had once been running on precepts, charts, formulas, and multiplication tables. And now we are running on constitutions and establishment codes. Thank you very much. And be sure to check out the full story this fall.
Thank you so much, Chamini, and thank you again to all the readers, Mirgul, Shafiq, Bernard, and Chamini. And as Chamini said, if you got an interest in these stories by hearing these excerpts, please do check out the past issues, summer and fall 2020, and the forthcoming fall 2021 issue. And if you're a translator, please consider submitting to us at the Massachusetts Review. Thank you so much for joining us.